Um, Welcome to Emerging Feminist Research on Asia Speaker Series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange for indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. As a migrant worker in Canada, I honor and respect these nations as the custodians of the land and waters on which we meet today. My name is Maria Huang, and I am assistant professor at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and also the Department of East Asian Studies. Together with Dr. Galgavili, I am co-directing the Emerging Feminist Research on Asia Speaker Series, which brings together scholars to unsettle familiar narratives and dominant discourses about Asia and people of Asian descent through a feminist lens. So our lecture today will be our last for the semester, but we will be back next semester with two more guest speakers, wonderful guest speakers. So, I'm sorry?
So you can't get rid of us now.
Not yet. So I encourage you all to visit our website if you'd like to know more about our past and speakers next semester. Our lectures are also video recorded and posted on our website. So I am thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gowri Vijayakumar. Dr. Vijayakumar is an assistant professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis University. Her research and teaching use feminist, queer, and transnational lenses to examine social movements, the everyday life of the state, and the political economy of globalization. Dr. Vijayakumar co-edited the volume, Sociology of South Asia, Post-Colonial Legacies, Global Imaginaries. She is also prolific and has published in top feminist and sociology journals, including Science and also Gender and Society. Today, Dr. Vijayakumar is joining us to discuss her award-winning book, At Risk, Indian Sexual Politics in the Global AIDS Crisis, which received the 2022 Transnational Book Award from the Asia and Asian American section of the American Sociological Association. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vijayakumar.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I think we've been planning this visit for like over a year. And in pandemic time, it feels like it goes by so fast, but I'm so glad that we could finally make this happen and that I could meet you all and be part of this very inspiring series. So what I'm presenting today, as Maria mentioned, is material from my book, which came out in 2021. And I'm gonna try to kind of give an overview of the book, but there's always so much ground to cover in talking about a whole book, so it's gonna be kind of a broad impression, and I hope you'll find kind of nuggets of it intriguing and ask me more about it in our discussion after. And this is also kind of my disclaimer to say that if you find things are sort of underdeveloped here, then hopefully you'll find them more developed in my book, and I'm happy to talk more about sort of what the overall book contains. Okay, so I'll just get started. So the global AIDS response is one of the largest global governance projects in history. Funding for HIV programs increased from $4.9 billion in 2001 to $23.3 billion in 2017, and was $21.5 billion in 2020. Aside from this global institutional response, I probably don't have to belabor this point, but AIDS has become kind of a celebrity cause in the West. So this is an example from the RED campaign, which many of you may have come across. And it's one example of this kind of commercialized celebrity support for response to the global AIDS crisis. In today's pandemic world, it's not hard to imagine how a pandemic can transform our lives and upend every aspect of our existence. And we know how pandemics can reconfigure politics too. We also know that pandemics cause mass suffering. So just in 2020, 680,000 people died of AIDS-related illnesses globally, and 36.3 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses since the start of the pandemic. And this is, of course, in this period now where we think of AIDS as a pandemic that has already passed. So when I started my project in the early 2010s, I was often told that AIDS was no longer worth studying. Oh, you should be seeing this. Okay. Yeah, that it was no longer worth studying. It wasn't a hot topic anymore. I had mentors tell me to change my dissertation topic. People said there was too much written about HIV and AIDS. And people were even more confused when I said I wanted to study India. I was just talking to you about this, to one of your students, that India was not the place where there was an AIDS crisis that was worthy of study. So typically, in the American popular imagination, AIDS is something that happened once long ago to white gay men in the United States, specifically maybe San Francisco and New York, and now it only happens to people in Africa. So this imaginary, as the editors of a recent volume called AIDS and the Distribution of Crisis point out, allows the erasure of an ongoing pandemic among Black, Latinx, and Native and other minoritized groups across North America and Europe, at the same time that it bolsters an imagination of Africa as a place of pandemic, disease, and poverty. So this is a map of global HIV infections, new HIV infections from UNAIDS. And you can see many of the countries on the map are grayed out because data isn't available for those countries. But I like this image because it kind of portrays some of this popular imaginary of where AIDS happens, right? This idea that the locus of disease is in sub-Saharan Africa. And within this imagined geography, India is not the site of an AIDS catastrophe. So this is kind of the picture now. But in the early 1990s, the picture was very different. Experts were convinced that AIDS would become a major crisis in India. So these are some headlines from the New York Times between 1987 and 1996. And you can see this kind of growing concern about India's ticking time bomb of an AIDS epidemic. Experts painted India as kind of a sexually conservative country that was ignoring this growing threat. And by the mid-1990s, Indian and North American AIDS experts agreed that India faced the biggest AIDS epidemic in the world, with 3 million people HIV positive and estimates ranging from 5 to 50 million people by the 2000s. And later, these estimates would actually be revised drastically downward. So they were revised down to 2.4 million by 2007. So this narrative actually shifted pretty dramatically. But during this time, massive global financial resources were infused into the AIDS response in India. So the funds came from a range of major donors like the World Bank, the Global Fund, DFID, and the Gates Foundation. Just to give you a sense, this is a chart representing overseas development aid to India from the late 1990s through to 2018. So the green line is funding for STD control and AIDS, and the gray line is for health sector funding, so like the whole rest of the health sector. And you can see that the funding for STD and AIDS exceeds funding for the entire rest of the health sector at several points in this trajectory. And those points are when new phases of the National AIDS Control Program were starting. So that big spike in 2007 is the National AIDS Control Program's third phase, which was a commitment of $2.5 billion. And actually, India is an outlier here. So if you looked at the same graph for Kenya, which is another place where I did research, the green line is above the gray line for the whole period of time. So there's been more funding for AIDS than for the entire rest of the health sector from global sources. And part of that is because Kenya is a country that receives US aid through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So at the same time, HIV prevalence, or the proportion of the population living with HIV in India, has always actually been relatively low. So at its peak in 1998, it was about 0.5% of people. Today, it's about 0.2%. India has a really big population, of course. So this 0.2% means about 2.1 million people are living with HIV in India. So it does have the third largest epidemic in the world. But in relation to India's population, AIDS is just one of many competing forms of violence and exclusion and disease. So just as an example, in the early 2000s, which is around the time this kind of narrative of crisis was ascendant, 120,000 adults in India died of malaria per year, and 100,000 of AIDS-related causes, so about the same number. But donors dispersed in 2006 $19 million for malaria control and $108 million for AIDS, so 5 times the amount for AIDS as for malaria. So India's encounter with AIDS offers an intriguing site to study the intersection of global crisis and local politics. On the one hand, by the early 2000s, India was receiving massive amounts of money from global donors and the political pressure that came with that global funding to respond to this crisis, which they said was going to be a devastating crisis in India. On the other hand, for the everyday lives of people in India, AIDS didn't seem like an urgent or pressing concern, and there were many other issues that immediately affected their lives. The other key feature of HIV, and this is central to my project, and something that makes it in some ways different from, say, COVID, is that it affected in particular groups who were criminalized and marginalized. So in India in particular, these were cisgender women in sex work, transgender women, some sex workers, some not sex workers, and men who have sex with men, including Indian collective formations, which have many different terms, which we can talk about, such as Koti, Hijra, and Aravani. And so the AIDS response in India meant some unusual encounters. Here's, for example, a picture of Bill Gates talking with a group of sex workers in Bangalore. This is actually like one of the places where I did field work, and I did field work with some of these women. I wasn't there during this visit. It happened before my field work, and this is a publicly available photo. But just to give you a sense of sort of the global funders and their sort of high-profile engagement with groups of women who would never have encountered this kind of these kinds of global formations in this way before. So one of the driving interests of my book then is this kind of unexpected alliance. At the same time that they were criminalized and subject to everyday state violence by one arm of the state, they were regularly harassed by police, arrested, detained, etc. Sex workers were also brought into this massive public health effort by the AIDS response. And so they're talking to Bill Gates, and they're also getting arrested when they go outside of the HIV prevention office. So HIV prevention programs presented spaces in which these kind of forms of sexuality and gender that posed a risk to the nation were reformulated as central to the nation's success on the world stage, or what I call the global AIDS field. So my basic research question comes out of this contradiction. So I ask, how did the AIDS crisis reconfigure Indian sexual politics? And there are a few questions related to this. What did it mean for India's place in the world order? What did it mean for how the state related to sex workers, sexual minority, and transgender activists? Sexual minority is the term that's used in India for a variety of groups. And what did it mean for the everyday lives of people who were designated at risk of HIV? So what my book argues, and this is in relation to these questions, is that AIDS cut to the heart of tensions about the kind of nation state India was and could be. AIDS experts charted a shift from India's kind of poverty and sexual morality to modernity and tolerance. And this was a shift that happened over time as an emerging world power. And here, I'm particularly interested in how Indian officials imagine themselves in relation to Africa and this kind of racialized global hierarchy. Second, AIDS transformed the terrain on which at-risk groups engaged the state and gave them a conditional opening for making demands and actually kind of mobilizing as activists. And third, HIV prevention reshaped people's lives as they learned new ways of naming themselves, new ways of embodying and practicing sexuality. So ultimately, what I want to show in my book is that global institutions' response to crisis can transform political life in intimate ways as well as kind of larger scale ways. And here is where my argument is in contrast to some other studies of global institutions that tend to look at global institutions as having a more top-down effect on people's lives. So here, I really try to emphasize the back and forth contestations between sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender activists, and the global institutions that come with the HIV response. So I won't spend too much time on this, and I'm happy to talk more about it if anyone is interested, but I did kind of want to give you a sense of the scholarly literatures that sort of inspire my approach. So one is a literature specific to AIDS and HIV, and that's the literature on AIDS exceptionalism. And this literature talks about kind of the rise of AIDS as a celebrity cause, as I was mentioning earlier, and the concrete effects of that, right? So the ways that the AIDS response has actually drawn resources away from other equally important issues because it became a kind of darling cause of donors in the West. So scholars like Adia Benton, for example, have shown how people contest and engage with these kind of exceptionalizing logics of crisis. And some of this may be familiar to you in relation to other causes, too, that kind of take on this exceptional role. Second, I use the literature on global fields in sociology, which looks at how states compete with each other for material resources and status kind of within global fields of struggle. So here, just kind of in relation to my book, the relationship that's particularly relevant is between India and Africa. So the way India sort of sees itself in relation to African countries, as well as, of course, representing itself to donors in the West, specifically US, Canada, and the UK. And then finally, I draw on feminist and queer sociologists who study the state. And here, I look at how the state is a terrain of struggle. So the state may have one way it wants to respond to a crisis like HIV, but activists also engage on the terrain of the state, and they can actually sort of transform the way the state defines a disease. And that is what happened in the context of AIDS in India. And the state can, at the same time, transform the way people see themselves. So what I will also hope to show you is that the AIDS response actually changed the way people understood themselves in surprising ways sometimes. So this is just an overview, and I'm happy to talk more about this if it's interesting to anyone. So I'll tell you a little bit about my research sites and my methods for this project. So my main research sites were Bangalore, Kolkata, and Nairobi. I also did some fieldwork in Delhi, in Chennai, in Maharashtra, in Mysore. These are other cities and states in India. But the heart of the project was actually in Bangalore. And the reason for that is that it is the capital of a state, Karnataka, which was designated as a focus state for the HIV response in the early days of the pandemic. And so because it was a focus state, there were many different actors kind of competing for resources within the context of Bangalore. But it's also because Bangalore is the city I had studied before, so I had familiarity with some of its kind of political landscape. I spoke the language spoken in Bangalore, Kannada, so that made research much easier. So the bulk of the research was participant observation and interviews. So I talked both with government officials and with grassroots members of sex worker organizations. I chose 3 organizations to kind of spend more time with for my participant observation. Often this meant kind of getting pretty intimately involved in what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's also worth mentioning, I'll just say, that many of the people I interviewed were not HIV positive. So a lot of them were kind of part of these HIV prevention programs, and they were part of them because they were part of at-risk groups. And they were running prevention programs. So they were distributing condoms, they were bringing in people to get tested, but they were not, their lives were not directly affected by being HIV positive. So in the first part of the talk, this is the set of arguments I showed you earlier. I'll focus on this part. And then I'll talk about this last part. And if anyone's interested in the second part, I'm also happy to talk about that. I just don't want to throw too much at you in this short time we have. So I'll just start with the first argument. So in the early 1980s, there was already a debate within the Indian medical literature about whether AIDS was really a crisis at all. And this question was already tied up with India's place in the world order. So what kind of countries could India be compared to? So on one hand, some commentators were comparing India to African countries. So this is a 1994 article in the Journal of the Indian Medical Association. And this is an article by the director of the National AIDS Control Organization. So here he says the trends in Bombay are comparable to the trends earlier observed in some of the African states like Nairobi, Addis Ababa from mid-'80s onwards. This is how he puts it. And he says the trends are so similar as to forewarn us about the impending epidemic of HIV involving the general population, as has happened in these African countries. So I just want to note here, there's a certain kind of temporal logic. So Africa is kind of what happened before, and India wants to prevent what happens next with this trajectory. Africa is kind of serving as a warning of what's to come. On the other hand, this is a 1995 editorial in the same journal that's much less concerned about the risk of AIDS. So here, the author says AIDS might just be a prelude to test the so-called AIDS vaccine on the Asian people, and it's in fact being disseminated from the developed countries notorious for their permissive society. So here you can see this other side of this debate, right? So here, AIDS is a Western disease, and the West stands in for sexual promiscuity, and it's not really a problem of that a developing country like India is really going to face. And in fact, the problem is that the sexually permissive West is kind of subjugating the sovereignty of the third world. And keeping in mind that this is the 1990s, India is a post-colonial nation state kind of asserting itself on the world stage. So I just have a couple of images from some of the public health campaigns of the time to give you a sense of how this played out kind of in terms of public health communication. So these images are posters, HIV prevention posters. And you can see that they kind of emphasize this monogamous, heterosexual home against the dangers of foreign sex. And what's implied here in this one, for example, is that the man is going to go to this city and have sex with a sex worker. Here it says, don't bring back AIDS. What's less addressed in these kinds of posters is homosexuality, right? But while the public health campaigns don't talk about homosexuality, you'll see that in a second that the newspaper articles and medical journal articles were actually really preoccupied with homosexuality, and there was an ongoing debate about it. And it was tied to kind of ideas of Western sexuality. So in this example, I'll show you. Okay. So an Indian expert told the press that Indian values would ward off AIDS and gave the example that the homosexuality percentage in India is 5 to 15% homosexuals, but in the US it's 40 to 60%. So a lot of scholars have written about these kind of binaries of Western and Indian sexuality, right? So one of the charges against Indian LGBTQ activists in recent years, for example, has been, that they're too Westernized. But less has been written about the idea of Africa in these discourses. And, here I'm trying to bring these ideas of Africa back into the story. So this is from Cindy Patton, who writes that global imaginaries of AIDS can be mapped directly onto pre-existing national and cultural formations. And the idea of Africa is actually really key to how AIDS has been talked about around the world in the AIDS literature. So over time, you'll see that the kind of medical journal articles and newspaper articles stopped being as preoccupied with the West, and they started to settle on this idea that India, doesn't have a homosexual epidemic; it has a heterosexual epidemic, and that means that it's more like Africa than the West. So there's again a certain kind of temporal geography to this. So here in this article, you see the description of AIDS spreading from gay communities in San Francisco to entire populations in sub-Saharan Africa, and then sort of spreading to the Asia-Pacific region. Here's another example that kind of puts it more directly. This is from Siddharth Dubey, who's a public health activist at the time, who says Africa's present HIV/AIDS caused hell is very probably India's future. And there was also kind of a circuit of researchers at this time. So researchers from Canada, from the US, from South Africa, Kenya, from India, were traveling kind of across different research institutions, reinforcing these ideas of this particular trajectory. And what I'm emphasizing here is, not whether these trajectories were correct or not, but the ways that they discursively constructed Africa as kind of a frightening alternative to India's current reality, but also sort of different from the Western trajectory of HIV. So India was kind of carving out a place in between these two possible futures. And this meant that after the first case of AIDS was identified in India, and that was in 1986, the state started cracking down on particular groups of people. And the first groups they cracked down on were sex workers and Africans, or in the medical literature, a pool of infected women and foreign students. Foreign students is kind of code for African students in this case. And after there was one African student who was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced that all foreign students would have to be HIV tested before coming to India. And by 1987, 11 African students had already been deported. What I also want to note is that there were protests to these crackdowns almost immediately. So this is an example of a protest. This is one of the first protests of HIV policy in India. In 1987, African students protested the testing requirements, and they argued that it amounted to medical apartheid. So in the case of Indian sex workers, there was a similar kind of process of kind of coercive HIV testing. In 1988, there was a famous case in Chennai led by an activist named Shamla Nataraj to challenge the detention of HIV-positive sex workers. So in 1990, over 900 women had been brought from Bombay to Madras on a train that was called the Mukti Express. Mukti means freedom, so the Freedom Express. And they were brought, and the newspaper article describes it as a symbol of freedom. They were brought to Chennai and put in basically like an open-air prison, limited food, limited access to medical care. They weren't allowed to see their families, and they were there to be tested for HIV. Two of them died while they were in that detention. One died by suicide. And this case, this kind of early case of activism against this detention resulted in 800 women being released from detention eventually. So that was also one of the earliest cases of AIDS activism in India. So this AIDS activism in the early 1990s worked across constituencies. So here's an example of a couple of reports put out by the AIDS Bedbav Virodi Andolan, which was one of the first AIDS activist groups in India. And they protested a range of different AIDS policies, including the detention of an HIV-positive gay man in Goa named Dominic D'Souza. They protested the doctors refusing to treat an African diplomat who was in India who ended up dying of AIDS. And these reports were also notable because they were the first, some of the first major activist reports on homosexuality in India. So this report, Less Than Gay, for example, laid the groundwork for the Indian challenge to anti-sodomy law, Section 377, which would ultimately be overturned in 2018, so not very long ago. But the first challenge to it came actually out of the AIDS activist movement. So this activism became a major challenge to the state's AIDS response. And by the mid-1990s, there were several organizations who were working with the government in some cases, with global donors in some cases, to respond to HIV. So here's another example of one such activist group in Kolkata. This is a collective of 65,000 sex workers based out of a red light district in Kolkata who came out of the HIV response, but now sort of do all sorts of other work as well. Many other organizations like this I talk about in my book across India, both rural and urban areas. So far, I've been talking about kind of the 80s and 90s, early years of the pandemic, in which Indian experts were kind of dismissing homosexuality for the most part and fanning this panic of a sort of African-style HIV epidemic with all of the kind of discursive baggage that represents. What I want to do now is kind of shift to the time when I was doing fieldwork, which was later. It was 2012 when I started my fieldwork. And this narrative had now been largely replaced by this kind of activist legacy. So there was a new narrative of HIV in India, no longer kind of sitting on an epidemiological time bomb, this kind of crisis waiting to happen. There was now a narrative of India as a successful nation state that had responded to HIV effectively. I want to point out here again how Africa sort of serves as a discursive bolster for this claim of India's rise on the world stage. So the idea of India as successful, in contrast to sub-Saharan Africa, you can see in this excerpt from a newspaper article. It starts by talking about vast swaths of densely populated, unhygienic living quarters, crippling poverty, the next sub-Saharan Africa, and now this sort of shift into India's rise on the global stage. And these comparisons also appeared a lot in my interviews with policymakers. And here we see some of the news coverage of India's successful AIDS response. And I just want to kind of point out, this narrative of India's rise wasn't just about preventing disease, right? It was also about what kind of country India is. And this is from a high-ranking AIDS official who I interviewed, who talks about the AIDS response as a point of national pride. In the early years, India had been this kind of traditional country with these traditional sexual values that would never be able to stop HIV. And by the 2010s, it was kind of this modern nation that was capable of leading the world in its AIDS response. And you can see this sort of, at least something we can show as a success. And the audience for this is the global AIDS community, right, which includes donors around the world. It's a kind of a set of comparisons relationally between both the West and Africa. So far, I've shown you about the first part of my argument, how AIDS exposed tensions about the kind of nation-state India was and could be within what I've called the global AIDS field. In the second part of the talk, I want to move into the HIV prevention offices where I did my fieldwork to show you how they transform people's lives in kind of concrete ways. So I want to just give a little context for this. In the 2000s, the Indian state increasingly incorporated community-based organizations into the HIV response. And part of this was a kind of practical reasoning. So many of the government officials who were running these HIV programs had no experience with any kind of work related to sexuality or gender, let alone kind of criminalized groups like sex workers and people who were homosexual or transgender. So the AIDS crisis demanded that the Indian state would have to go outside its usual frameworks. And that specifically means working with people who were criminalized, right? This is a time when, Section 377 was in place. People were arrested for same-sex sexuality. Sex workers were regularly arrested. But the HIV response had to work with these groups because they were the groups who had been designated at risk. So this meant that they had to work with organizations who had expertise in working with the state, working with these groups. And then the other side of this is that for the groups at the heart of the crisis, HIV was only one part of their lives, and it was only one thing that made their lives feel precarious and unlivable, and often kind of the least important thing on the agenda, right? So here, one of my interviewees, who I call Hajira, explains why for some sex workers, the threat of HIV is really abstract. So she says, anyway, I'm going to die. What happens in life? Everyone left me. Why should I live, right? And this is partly in response to a question about, why do people are not interested in HIV prevention? And she's sort of explaining that, for a sex worker who is marginalized in so many different ways, subject to everyday violence in so many ways, HIV just doesn't seem like a very important issue, and it's not really an important issue for her. So in this context, in order to be successful, community-based organizations had to play a key role in kind of transforming people's lives, not just in relation to disease. And this is one of the first interviews that I conducted with Raghu, who is a director of an activist NGO. And he says it this way. So he says, HIV gave me an identity. This might be surprising because HIV is a life-threatening disease. It was devastating people in queer communities in India. People were dying. But it's at the heart of what I want to talk about in this section of the talk. So why is it that HIV gave people an identity? So I'm going to talk about, how am I doing on time? 4:45. Okay, I'm good. I want to talk about 3 ways that people's lives were transformed by HIV prevention programs. So naming sexuality, diversified income, and shared space. So first, naming sexuality. Naming sexuality was central to the everyday experience of HIV prevention programs for the activists I interviewed. Initially, in the early years of the AIDS response in India, there were kind of 3 categories that were considered to be the at-risk groups. Men who have sex with men, female sex workers, and IV drug users. And the HIV state response had different streams of programming for these 3 different groups. So they kind of funded CBOs working with each of these different groups. And then over time, these groups kind of expanded, right, and in response to some activism. So eventually, other categories like Koti, Satla Koti, double-decker, Panti, bisexual, Jogappa, these all were sort of incorporated into the HIV response to categorize men who have sex with men. One of the responses, for example, was transgender women who said they didn't want to be categorized as men who have sex with men because they are not men. Female sex workers were also categorized in a number of ways based on kind of places of solicitation, places of work, et cetera. So all of these categories sort of proliferated within the HIV response. But what I want to note is that within HIV prevention programs, naming became very important to everyday life. So when someone entered an HIV drop-in center for the first time, they would attend a counseling session where they would talk about their sexual practice, and the interviewer would kind of tell them a category that would be checked off on a form. And many of my interviewees told me that the very first time they heard about the term that they regularly use to describe themselves was in HIV prevention. So people would say, I didn't know it was called sex work till I came to this office, or I didn't know I was a koti, or I didn't know I was a bisexual until I came to this organization. In the Sunday meeting of this one CBO where I did field work, every meeting would begin with a round of introductions, which would kind of solidify these identities, right? So people would say, my name is Akshay, I am a koti. And these introductions were also used when people went outside of the organization. So this is a quote from someone I interviewed who I call Srinivas, who's talking about why naming is so important. Because I was kind of asking him, why is it so important for people to know what to call themselves? And he's complaining here about people who don't know the correct terminology for themselves. So he said people should know what they are, and he says, they don't know with clarity, they're confused. Some people call themselves a panti, but they're actually a DD, a double-decker. They don't know with clarity. And then he says that he, understood that he was a bisexual after being trained. So I just want to emphasize this idea of like being trained to understand that you're a bisexual, right? He learns that through the process of working at an HIV prevention program. So this is the dynamic that I'm thinking of when I say naming sexuality was a key mechanism. The second one is diversified income. So here I want to talk about one of my interviewees who I talk about more in my book, and I call her Preeti. So Preeti was a transgender woman. She had previously been part of the Hijra community, so she had kind of previously identified as a Hijra, and she had sort of moved out of the Hijra community. She now preferred to identify as a transgender woman, and she was a migrant as well. She had moved to Bangalore from Shivamogga, which is a smaller city outside of Bangalore, and she had actually come to HIV prevention work after a breakup. So she had been with a partner who was kind of paying her rent, and after the breakup, she became really depressed, and she was looking for a place to kind of find connection. So she became an HIV peer educator. But in this quotation from one of our interviews, she's talking about how she changed once she started working for an HIV prevention organization. So she says, before, I used to spend a lot on clothing. I'd buy the cloth in the morning, get it stitched in the afternoon, and wear that outfit and go out in the evening. The neck would be this deep, and I'd pull the veil up like this. So she's kind of showing me like how she would make herself look really sexy for her time out. And she says now, back then that was my only job. Sex work was my only way of earning. But now I don't make the neck deep. I go and sit at the bar. I start drinking, and the clients come to me on their own. And then I say I work at an HIV prevention NGO. So what I want to point out here is the transformation Preeti is talking about. So working at an HIV prevention NGO didn't just mean that she had more public health knowledge. It also meant she'd become a different kind of person, a person who doesn't put their sexuality on display even when doing sex work, a person who dresses in a more middle-class, respectable way, who covers her body and is more docile and demure in public. And all of this is tied to her sources of income. So she's saying, sex work is no longer my main identity. I'm also an HIV prevention worker. And this kind of gave her the opportunity to engage differently in the world. So finally, okay, let's to work. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. A final element of how HIV prevention programs mobilize new forms of sexual identity was shared space. So I kind of want to talk about the actual space of the drop-in center, what it felt like to be there, and how it changed people's everyday practices. So this is a picture of a drop-in center. You can see the big piles of, these are boxes of condoms that come in from the government. There's almost always a TV, but lots of decorations too. And you can't really see this because of the picture, but there would often be maps of hot spots on the wall showing different places where sex work takes place, or cruising spots for kotis and pantis. And these became spaces where sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people could get together. So places where people could be away from public harassment and violence. Places where people were hidden away from kind of the police harassment they would often experience. What was also interesting was that these places were often kind of hidden away. So if you came up on them on the street, you wouldn't really know what it was. The first time I went to one, for example, there was no sign on the street, and I went up the stairs, and there was this huge, beautifully lit office, the office where Bill Gates had visited, the South African Minister of Health had been there, the director of the National AIDS Control Organizations had been there, but you wouldn't have known any of that from looking at it from the street. So these were kind of private spaces where there was this room for negotiation and meeting people from around the country and around the world. At one of the offices I visited most regularly, and that's the one in this image, you often kind of walked in and there was a pile of shoes you had to climb over. The TV was almost always on. People would have impromptu dance parties. People would kind of move fluidly through the office, and when people walked into the office, they started to feel less rigid. So they would snuggle, play with each other's hair, rest their heads on each other's laps, play games, joke, argue. There was always tea in the morning and afternoon. And then nearing kind of 6 o'clock, when the office was preparing to close, people would get together, put on makeup together, and then go out. So these office spaces differed in how they were organized. So they sometimes were more like places where you would just see lots of people filling out paperwork. In other places, you would see people kind of talking and spending time together. Sometimes people would tell me the drop-in center is like my mother's house. People would do religious rituals in the HIV prevention center. So here's an example of like a space for doing pujas or Hindu rituals. In the office, people would have like Eid celebrations in the office, baby showers in the office. It was also a place where people could conduct sex work over the phone. So people would negotiate with clients while hanging out in the HIV prevention office. And they would negotiate over rates and services while spending time in the office. They would share clothing or jewelry they might have bought and talk about prices. This is also a conversation that I often became part of while sitting in the HIV prevention offices. So I also want to note that this shared space meant that, again, people were learning ways of engaging with each other. Here's a quote from an interviewee who I call Pallavi, who spent time in one of the HIV prevention offices. And she says, "I got courage from attending the meetings here. I learned how to talk to different kinds of people and the way to approach different kinds of people in different situations." And she talks about being a rural person. In Bangalore, one should talk neatly, prettily, with discipline. The words that come out of my mouth shouldn't hurt anybody. And she says, "I've been shouted at a lot in this office. They used to say that I hadn't learned everything, even after so many years, and that I talked strangely, and now I have become perfect. I can go to any person and talk to him without fear." So you can see this kind of contradictory transformation that's going on here. On the one hand, Pallavi's been disciplined to act in a certain way, right? In a way that I call respectable sexuality. She's learned to kind of meet certain norms of this space. But she's also talking about how it's given her a certain kind of a power, right? She's learned how to speak to people without fear. It's given her a certain kind of courage. So there's a certain kind of discipline that's combined with an ability to speak up for herself when she needs to. So this is something I've referred to as kind of a form of respectable sexuality. In one of my recent articles in Qualitative Sociology, I kind of talk about how these spaces become places where people learn how to negotiate with the state, even as they're also learning to embody respectable sexuality. But I also want to note that within these spaces in my fieldwork, I often saw people arguing about respectable sexuality too. So people saying, you should be wearing this. No, I don't want to wear that. I want to wear this instead. Or people making fun of certain forms of sexuality. For example, one time when I was in a drop-in center, people had just come back from doing this training session at one of the IT companies like Microsoft or IBM. These companies are really prominent in Bangalore. And they had met all these like English-speaking elite gay men, and they came back and they were making fun of their way of embodying sexuality and kind of talking about how it was too uptight and sort of not open enough. And this was also a way of kind of contesting the terms of respectable sexuality. So it wasn't just that discipline was taking place, it was also that arguments and contestations were going on. So I'm gonna just wrap up by trying to talk a little bit about some overall takeaways from this. So what I've shown you here is an ethnographic approach to a massive global disease response effort that tries to center the experiences of those who were thought to embody the heart of the risk, right? The groups who were at risk of disease and also posed a risk to the nation. And I want to suggest that this kind of ethnographic approach can offer some directions in talking about global processes and macro forces. In contrast to the kind of typical critique of a donor like the Gates Foundation and its way of sort of imposing its will, here what I've tried to show is that even though these global donors were powerful and did impose their will, there were also moments where people contested the terms of that donors attempted to set, strategized on that terrain and attempted to sort of redirect the HIV response. And they were able, in some cases, to undercut the dominance of global institutions and even sort of redefine what a crisis was and could be. So sort of challenging the AIDS response's focus on disease prevention in narrow terms and broadening it to talk about things like sexual identity, to talk about things like criminalization and the law, and to talk about family relationships or the visibility of sexual minorities in public spaces. So these demands also did take shape in kind of more collective ways. So this is one of the organizations I've worked with more closely, the Karnataka Sex Workers Union in 2010. And it was a group that kind of came out of some of the HIV prevention work that I talked about. But at this protest, they're actually protesting the HIV prevention program. So they were arguing that HIV prevention had violated sex workers' privacy, kind of extended forms of surveillance, and demanded higher paying peer educator jobs, and kind of human rights advocacy for sex workers, including the decriminalization of sex work in some cases. So the last thing I'll say, and this is kind of now moving into today and sort of this period that is increasingly thought of in global health circles as like the end of AIDS. And I sort of refer to this a little bit at the beginning of the talk. So a lot of the activists I talked to were very aware that the period of time when HIV was kind of an exceptional crisis was temporary. So here's a quotation from Raj, somebody I call Raj, who's an NGO director. And he's talking here about how, the HIV attention and funding is only a matter of time. And he says the minute that HIV comes down to zero, you'll not be funded anymore, no one will care about you, you'll be back to being kind of ostracized, and you'll be dropped like hot potatoes, right? He's talking about how sex workers are only conditionally relevant to the Indian state, only when their risk of HIV poses a threat. So this was also something that I heard from sex workers, right? So this is a picture of a sex worker who I became close friends with during my field work. Her name, I call her Lata in my book. And she was a sex worker, peer educator in an HIV program. She eventually became a sex worker activist. And then, as some of the HIV prevention programs lost funding, she left organizing and she opened a bangle store. So this is a picture of her bangle store where I visited her. And that later became a flower shop. So she was kind of moving into different types of work over the years that I knew her after my fieldwork was over. And if you talk to her, in her bangle shop, you would never know that she was a sex worker activist who had traveled all over the country. She had marched at the front of protests. She had met government officials. But she had also done all sorts of other work. So she'd been a garment worker, flower seller, she'd been a cook, she'd done lots of different community organizing work. And after the HIV crisis had sort of been thought to pass, she was kind of left behind. So this is from two different conversations I had with her. She says, what feels unjust in what they did is that they brought us all out, but then left us. And here she's specifically talking about the ways that HIV prevention programs ask sex workers to kind of come out, to identify themselves, in some cases, identify themselves publicly at great risk to their lives and their relationships with their families. And then kind of, after the HIV crisis was over, there was no longer the same support that they had previously had. Here she says, they came and did something and left. We still have to be here. So in the period of crisis, she was at the center of the HIV response, and now she's living in the aftermath. The donors have gone home, and she's still here. So I just want to close by saying that the AIDS response has brought into contact people like Lata with people like Bill Gates and everything in between. And that's all aside from the fact that Lata has faced a conjuncture of brutal circumstances. So she, and I talk about her more in my book, but she had faced sexual violence in many different contexts. She had struggled in her relationship to her son. She eventually had sort of been able to achieve financial autonomy largely outside of HIV prevention programs. And the HIV epidemic kind of forced attention to people like her. But then once the crisis was over, she went back to being marginalized and criminalized. And I think this is why I think it's important to bring this kind of ethnographic approach to a global crisis like AIDS. Now we're moving into a period that we also could think of as a post-pandemic, post-crisis period, but let that kind of suggest a different feminist orientation to the trajectory of risk and blame. She's forcing us to question, who's post-pandemic, who lives after the crisis, and who is constantly living crisis, and who is constantly being deemed unworthy of life. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayakumar, for really fascinating talk. We read this book for my class last semester, and it's such a timely book because it helps the students think about how race, gender, sexuality really shape how certain bodies are constructed as vectors of disease, right? And also known as collateral capitalism. So we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Could you give us just very briefly a sense of the different chapters? I'm just really curious to see how you kind of do that in the book in terms of kind of the narrative, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'd love to. This is something I really struggled with, actually. So, I had like a bunch of different structures for the book at different times. And what I ended up doing, and I guess so some of you have maybe read it, so you can tell me if it worked. But I basically started with the part I showed you at the beginning, which was about the early AIDS response and the global AIDS field. That was kind of the first chapter. So I started with global fields, and then I kind of thought of it as like a funnel in and a funnel out. So I talked then about national level politics. I then talked about politics within Bangalore and the organizations in Bangalore and the everyday life, the kind of second part of the talk today, and then kind of worked back out. So so the chapters after that are about the translation of HIV prevention strategies to Kenya, and then the last chapter is exclusively in Kenya. So it's about HIV prevention programs in Kenya that were modeled on the Indian HIV response. So I didn't talk about that today, but that's kind of where the book ends. And then I come back to India kind of like toward the end of the book. So yeah, I mean, it's a complicated thing to understand like the complexity of the AIDS response. And it's almost, I think for people who study AIDS, and I don't know if anyone who studies global health politics is here, but there's this really messy set of organizations, donors, organizations of different kinds, and it's not easy to structure that into a linear narrative. But that was how I did it.
I'm Catherine Lemons, in the Anthropology Department. Nice to meet you, and thank you for this lovely talk. I look forward to reading the book. I have it here.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question actually about how, you've given us this amazing account in part because you've worked from the very macro to the very micro and also across a huge sort of segment of time. And I suppose my question is simple in a way. You give us, on the one hand, this account where you argue that the response to the AIDS crisis shifts India, and I take this to be sort of in international perception from, I think you said, poverty and morality to modernity and tolerance. Right? And we saw as we shifted from the early moment until your field work that this is viewed, presumably by the so-called international community, as a success. Right?
Yeah.
India didn't become Africa.
Yeah.
And yet I found myself wondering, as you moved more into the micro, whether the people who participate in the organizations where you did field work would also consider this a success. And whether these terms that that people who either run these organizations or work in them or do outreach, would these be terms would success be a sort of term that they might use?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people, this is definitely, you're asking a very nuanced question, and I'll just it's interesting because I've often had people ask me, do I think the Indian AIDS response was a success? And I'm always like, well, it depends on who you ask because of what you're pointing out, which is that on the global stage, Indian researchers, Indian state officials, but also some of the like North American researchers who are working with the Gates Foundation were really constructing this as a success because the Gates Foundation's goal is to create replicable models. They're less interested in kind of the aftermath of the replicable model. So they want a model that's good and that they can prove is good through quantitative strategies. And then they want to export that model to other places, which is what they attempted to do with the programs that I was looking at. And so, yeah, I mean, there was, and I have a chapter in my book that's about quantification, so about all of those like reports that construct this as a success. So I mean, your question about whether the people in the organizations thought it was a success, whether like somebody like Lata, who I talked about at the end, thought of it as a success, I don't even think that vocabulary matters to her, because for her, and this is, what I saw, especially as I mapped out the trajectory of her life, like she was in a lot of different forms of exploitation at different points of her life, in her marriage, in her work, in her like factory work, in her organizations, even in her HIV prevention work, and then she was in her bagel shop, and at all those points there were just like different kinds of jobs, really, and different ways that she was relating to state officials and to police and her family and, a range of different actors. But the vocabulary of success was like not there at all, which is interesting because, I think even now if you look on the Gates Foundation's materials about HIV, they often use images of women in sex work to talk about their success. So one of the success metrics is actually like the empowerment of women in sex work. Even though, after the HIV response was over, there was no long-term programming like to keep women in sex work, sustained or with stable livelihoods. So yeah, I think you're pointing out an important contradiction. Yes.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk, and I too look forward to reading the book. I'm interested in hearing more about your field work and the experience of it and the reception of it. Because as you were talking about ethnography, I was thinking about the challenges and difficulties attendant upon the ethnographic observer's perspective. And were there times in your work that you felt unwelcomed by the situation, the context, the people you were working with? And if so, what did you find yourself doing, and how did you find yourself thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whether I ever felt unwelcome. Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I think the traditional idea of as an ethnographer is like this cowboy ethnography model of going into this place where no one has ever studied people, and you're documenting these untold stories. And the HIV response in India is not that. There's tons of researchers, but they're all public health researchers who do surveys of sexual behavior. And then they leave. And so when I first started my field work, a lot of people thought I was one of those researchers. And actually, I remember the first community meeting I went to at one of the organizations I worked with. I introduced myself, and then there was this young trans man activist who was part of the organization who was basically like, what are you doing here? Like, we've seen so many researchers come in and out. Explain to us like why you're here and what you're going to do once you leave. And I was like forced to account for the fact that ethnography means you're accountable to multiple audiences, and a lot of times academic institutions ask us to be accountable to them more than to the people we study. So and that really changed my thinking, right? So like I still work with that organization like outside of my research work, but at the time I wasn't sure how I fit into the scope of research or what kind of researcher I was. I think like part of being an ethnographer too is time. Like the more time I spent, the more people made me feel welcome. I'll also say, like, a lot of people were incredibly generous and didn't make me feel unwelcome at all. And that's also a function of, like, my privilege as a researcher, my privilege as coming from the US, of coming from an upper caste background, of being middle class, but also some other things that made me feel familiar. Like, I was the same age as a lot of people I was talking to. I was in my late 20s when I was doing field work. A lot of the sex workers I was talking to were the same age as me. And we were talking about, like, some similar experiences sometimes. And I was speaking in Kannada, which actually made a big difference when a lot of, like, other researchers they had met didn't. So yeah, but it was a complex balancing act in a lot of ways. Sure.
Thank you for the lecture, first of all. I was just wondering, you mentioned how the HIV prevention programs do privacy of sex workers, and also, like, at the beginning they didn't really consider HIV to be the main issue they were facing. So how did the state then, like, encourage sex workers to get involved? Was it really through the diversification of income, or were there other factors?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so a lot of it was through the work of these community organizations, right? And what's interesting is that the state agencies that were running the HIV response, which were eventually working with some of these global donors, but not initially, they, like, looked for activist groups to help them because they didn't know. Like, I talked to HIV officials who literally, like, the way the Indian bureaucracy works, for those who don't know, is, like, people will get transferred from, like, the tourism department or, like, the water department. They have no idea, like, about the thing that they're in charge of. And so they'd talk to me and be like, well, I didn't know that there were gay people in India, or, like, I don't know how to tell who a sex worker is. And they would meet these activists who would show them, you know, literally, like, open up the geography of sexuality and teach them things. And that also meant there was some negotiation, because these organizations, like, and I write about this too, like, a lot of them are pretty savvy. So they would say, okay, well, we're working with you, but then that means that we're going to work on our terms. So, like, you're going to give us funding to do, like, a livelihood project, or to advocate for, better laws around sexuality, or to, like, protest this police officer who's really abusive. So those organizations did a lot of that mediating work to bring people into the HIV response. And, you know, I don't want to say it was, like, a uniformly positive or negative, if we want to use those terms. Like, it continued to be a form of surveillance, but it also did offer some opportunities for advocacy and for negotiation. And yeah, but I would say, like, a lot of those violations of privacy continued, and that's why some of these activist groups were protesting them, but they also, those activist groups received funding from those same programs they were protesting. So they were very creative in reusing those resources.
So, as you said, the response to HIV was, like, a new wave of modernity and tolerance, and like, more LGBTQ people and sex workers become visible, new ways of embodying sexuality, which is amazing. But my question is, like, for sure, I imagine that there were people that did not love this idea of this new coming modernity and tolerance, and India has been perceived like a country of sexual morality. So, was there any backlash against this new wave of modernity and tolerance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I think part of your question, yeah, was there backlash against the idea of India as sexually tolerant? I mean, this goes beyond HIV, right? Because this is also the period. I mean, so HIV was sort of a catalyst, and a lot of the early activism against Section 377 was catalyzed by HIV, purely because of the material resources that HIV funding provided. So people, like, used HIV funding to hold meetings for their, like, advocacy against 377. So this activism was catalyzed, but then was, you know, far beyond the realm of HIV. And yeah, I mean, there has been some backlash. Like, we could see that in the legal cases in India around homosexuality in particular. So Section 377, which I've talked about was overturned in 2009, and then it was reinstated in 2013. And then it was again overturned in 2018. And that whole back and forth process was like a result of backlash. And between 2013 and 2018, there was another case that extended rights to transgender people specifically, but not to other groups within the sexual minority, within the umbrella of 377. So like other people who have sex against the order of nature, according to the section. So anyway, yeah, so there's been a back and forth process. Now what's interesting, and this is probably something that like might feel familiar in other contexts, is that the conservative right-wing political forces in India are increasingly like queer friendly. Because they have actually sort of like incorporated into marketing, seeming more modern. It's kind of become a more mainstream issue, but still within this like conservative, often really exclusionary Hindu framework. So anyway, but that's more in the last few years than the period I'm talking about. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I was really interested in what you were talking about, naming sexualities and how a lot of people like learn different labels through training at these groups. So I was curious with like how the use of like labels works beyond just these activist groups. Or, like, is there about this what value there was in like introducing the concept of labels on sexuality?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, you know, in some ways, this is one of the core questions in queer theory, right? Is like, why do we name ourselves certain things? Like, what do these names give us? Do these names just restrict the ways that sexuality can be expressed, or do they open things up? And, you know, there's been writing in sociology about how identities are both, like, they both narrow identity, but they also in some ways need to be narrowed in order for activism to be possible, right? So I think you could see even from the range of terms I was using that different groups and actors used really different terms. So there were like the public health groups using, public health researchers using some terms. There were activist groups using other terms. They were all using them in strategic ways. What did that mean for like people? People in their everyday lives use a lot of different words to describe themselves. So what I kind of talk about a little bit in my book is that people use different words for themselves in different settings. So like in one place they'll be like, I'm a Koti. In another place they might say, I'm gay. In another place they might say, I'm transgender. Because Koti is actually a category that spans a lot of different terminologies that we'd be familiar with in the West. People also use the word community. So I have an article where I talk about how people would say, like, she's in the community when we were in public. And that was a way of saying, like, oh, that person's also a sex worker, or that person's also gay, without naming them as such. And I was even part of conversations where people would be like, you know, you can call me Koti in here, but when we go out on the street, call me a community person. So people, you know, as is probably not surprising, right? Like all of us are multivalent people who use lots of words to describe themselves. And I think, you know, what I saw was people being very creative, strategic, thoughtful about naming, and then at times using naming really effectively for political advocacy, even as they were very aware of the limitations of language in their everyday lives. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks.
So thank you for the talk. So I was wondering, you compared malaria and HIV and how like they both came drastically different reaction, although at some point you kind of had like similar death rates, if I'm not mistaken. And so I was wondering if you would argue that crises are socially produced, and if whether like naming or not labeling something as a crisis changes how it goes.
That's a great question. So do I think crisis is like purely socially constructed? Yeah, I mean, you know, that's a big question. I'll have to think about that. I mean, I do think that in the case of AIDS, you know, because I started my research, or I started being interested in HIV when I did research in South Africa when I was a college student. And, that was a case where HIV was an imminent crisis. Like, people were dying en masse. They were running out of rooms in the cemeteries. I mean, it was a crisis. And so what was interesting, in moving to research in India was like AIDS wasn't that, and the crisis was more contested. It was more a subject of debate. There were all these arguments about the numbers, about how to measure whether something's a problem or not. In that case, there was more of some construction going on. But I think, one of the things my research points to also is that people's everyday lives often feel like ongoing crises, right? So, and I talk about this a little bit in the context of some of the activist groups I worked with. They had these types of programs they called crisis response, which was like if somebody got arrested illegally, then they would call the organization and they would say, I'm in crisis. Or if their partner was violent, they would call and say, I was in crisis. So like crisis in the context of these organizations meant these kinds of everyday violences. And it actually didn't mean the AIDS crisis. Like rarely did it mean that. And so, I use that to kind of talk about how these everyday crises are actually like for people often immediate, right? And if you think about COVID, and this is not my subject of research, so I'm a little bit speculating here, but I mean, we could see how COVID amplified many everyday crises, right? So the effects of COVID were so radically different depending on how you were socially positioned, whether you could just work at home and like, be proud of yourself for like not getting exposed, or if you're like an essential worker or a caregiver or somebody who has to put yourself at risk every day and doesn't really have a choice. And so those kinds of differences are so clear to us now in this way, and they were, they're also like central to AIDS. And I think like COVID probably for a lot of people doesn't feel like the main crisis if you're in some other situation, like if you're unhoused, for example. Right? COVID is one risk of being unhoused, but there are lots of other risks of being unhoused too. So, so maybe I am leaning toward crisis is fully socially constructed. But I do think crisis is also a language that has so much resonance that it can be used. There has been a lot of writing on this too about how we're living in an age of crisis. Like everything's a crisis. There's like a autism crisis. There's like a crisis of schooling, there's a crisis of masculinity, like crisis language is everywhere, and it carries weight, and it carries material consequences too. So, yeah.
So thank you for the talk. I was kind of curious about the field work that you did in Kenya, and how basically it was said that the AIDS prevention crisis is not as successful, not seen as a success in Africa. So I was wondering, was there anything drastically different in the HIV prevention programs in Nairobi versus the ones in India?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I didn't talk about my fieldwork in Kenya here because in some ways it's like a different story and requires like different context. But yeah, so here I focused on how Indian officials talked about Kenya. In some of my fieldwork, I also talked to Kenyan officials about HIV prevention in Kenya versus India. So, my focus is on the relationship between the countries. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of debate among Kenyan HIV government officials and organizational leaders about whether India was actually like a useful model or not. So there were some people I talked to who said, we actually have a very successful history of preventing HIV. And, the numbers suggest that. Like, I talked to these sex worker organizations in Kenya that were really well established, that had been working for far longer than any of the organizations in India. They were, sex workers in Kenya on surveys have very high knowledge of HIV prevention strategies. But there were still all of these efforts to redesign the HIV response modeled on India. And I think that's, partly a result of some of these dynamics I'm talking about, this kind of these ideas of hierarchy of countries, right? This idea, and I would hear this from some Kenyan officials too. They would say India is an advanced country, and Kenya is more advanced than the rest of Africa. So we can't. I'd be like, well, why don't you take a model from Nigeria or another country that has similar HIV dynamics? And they'd be like, no, we can't be like any other country in Africa. India is more advanced, so we are going to model our response on India, even though India has a very different HIV epidemic. And so, part of what I'm pointing to is that these hierarchies actually push for sometimes really unexpected and the imposition of models that aren't relevant to people's lives. But it also can sometimes lead to some solidarity. So I also saw examples, really interesting ones, of Kenyan activists taking advantage of HIV programs. So in Kenya, there has also been an effort to overturn anti-sodomy law. So anti-sodomy law in that section I talked about is a British legacy, so it also exists in Kenya. And the effort to overturn that anti-sodomy law in Kenya has, the activists have worked with activists in India to learn about strategies for protesting it. So so there's some positive solidarities that come out of it too. I'll stop there.
This is just basically the question. I was just wondering, you spoke of the AIDS exceptionalisms, and I was wondering, at the time where that was a big movement, where celebrities would just use the same thing. Did that ever could you speak to how that appeared more locally in India? Did Indian celebrities do such I don't know, not advertisements, but
That's a good question. There were some Indian celebrities, but far fewer, and the ones who did take this on were the ones who are considered to be radical or leftist, not the really big time celebrities, I guess, or the ones who are known to be social justice oriented. Yeah, so it was pretty different, right? Because in the U.S. it's these Hollywood celebrities who take on this cause. So that's pretty different in that way.
One final question.
Yeah, one final question. Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was actually very interested, and actually you have been presenting your theoretical framework in terms of global fields
Yeah.
for competition amongst the states and also for resource sharing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, actually, to a certain extent, how your talking made me think about the risk society buyback.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether within these global fields, which affect sexuality and the construction of risk itself and responses, state concretely can enter in competition, and also, but this also links to what has been already asked, in terms of solidarity, perhaps produced bottom up by the activists, but you partially answered that. It's a lot of questions.
No, it's great. Yeah, I thought a little bit about the risk society framework when I was finishing the book. I wish I had come to it earlier because I think it would have been really helpful. I think the idea that risk is defining categories of people, right? Because all this discourse of India is going to go the way of Africa. It's all of this. These resources are put into something that hasn't happened yet. And preventing the crisis. And there's a financial logic to that too. It's if you invest in the risk, then you're not going to have the bigger expenses later on. Yeah, right. And practically it's cheaper to fund really poor sex workers to do condom distribution than to provide treatment once people get AIDS. Like that's the literal logic people were using. It's like it's a kind of perverse logic in some ways, and that led to a lot of exploitation. But yeah, so there is like a risk logic at play. And here, yeah, I think you're right. I'm kind of showing that risk logic also maps onto these national relationships of, and it plays out in epidemiology too, because in epidemiology, what people do to assess risk is use data from other places. So they like plug those numbers into a model based on an existing case, and they use that to predict the future, right? And so there are all these models. In my book, I talk a little bit about the models of like where the epidemic would go that were based on in these negotiations in the global field. So yeah, I don't think that's getting at your question about activists, but I think I hope I'm getting at the risk part. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayakumar.
Thank you.